Hello, friend. If you're here for the first time, I'm so glad you found your way. This channel is a quiet place. We do not rush here. We do not shout. We just go somewhere together, slowly, in the dark, and we stay a while. Tonight we're going very far back, further than most history tends to reach when it is looking for the lives of ordinary people. We're going all the way back to ancient Rome, and we're not going to the Forum, not to the Senate, not to the battlefields or the triumphal processions. We're going somewhere much more private than that. We're going into the rooms behind closed doors, behind the curtains, behind the polished surface of public life. We're going into the morning routines of Roman women, the quiet hours before the city fully woke, the small rituals performed in lamplight before anyone else was watching. Before we begin tonight, one small thing. If this channel becomes a place you want to return to, would you consider subscribing? And if this particular story moves you, a like helps more than I can explain. It takes about 2 seconds and it keeps this little corner of the internet alive. That's all. No pressure. Do it when it feels right. Here is something that I find genuinely remarkable, and I want to tell you this right now, right at the beginning, before we go any further. We know, from Roman medical texts and personal letters and household inventories that have survived for 2,000 years, that Roman women used a face cream made partly from sheep fat, starch and tin oxide. They called it cerussa. They applied it carefully to their skin, knowing that it gave a smooth, pale finish, knowing also, in some cases, that it carried its own quiet dangers. And they used it anyway. That detail, that one small fact about a cream applied by lamplight in a Roman bedroom 2,000 years ago, tells you something enormous about what beauty meant in that world. It was not casual. It was not effortless. It was a kind of work, a kind of knowledge, a kind of inheritance passed from woman to woman across generations, and it carried weight. So let us go there together. Let us go to Rome. Not the Rome of marble columns catching afternoon light, not the Rome of crowds and commerce and great men making speeches. Let us go to the Rome that existed in the early morning, in the private rooms, in the warm hours before the performance of the day began. Picture a city that never entirely goes silent. Even deep in the night, even in the residential neighborhoods set back from the main roads, Rome breathes and murmurs. Carts that are banned from the streets during daylight hours are allowed to rumble through after dark, carrying stone and timber and grain. Their wheels loud on the paving stones. Dogs bark. Somewhere a baby cries and is soothed. The smell of the city is layered and constant. Bakeries already firing their ovens before dawn. The mineral sharpness of the river. The cooking smoke that settles into everything over decades and never fully lifts. In a house set back from one of the quieter streets of the Aventine Hill, the sky outside the high, narrow windows is still the deep blue that comes just before the first grey light. The woman has been awake for a while already. Not restless, not anxious, just quietly present in the way that people who keep their own counsel tend to be. Her name does not matter for our purposes, or rather, her name could be any of a dozen common Roman names, Flavia or Claudia or Marcia or Licinia, because what she is about to do is not particular to her. It is the daily practice of thousands of women in this city, of different wealth and different circumstance, but all navigating the same essential task. The task of becoming presentable, of becoming, in the specific language of Roman social expectation, a woman who has attended to herself properly. She does not have the house to herself at this hour. She never does. In a Roman household of any means, there are always others awake before full light. Slaves whose day begins earlier than anyone else's, whose labor makes possible the smooth running of everything that happens between these walls. A woman with enough resources to maintain her appearance the way Roman society expected her to maintain it would have had at least one personal attendant devoted primarily to that task, often several. The role of the ornatrix, the woman who dressed and arranged another woman's appearance, was a recognized and skilled position in the Roman household. These women were not simply helpers in a general sense. They were specialists. They knew which oils worked best on which type of hair. They knew how to mix cosmetic preparations from ingredients stored in small labeled clay pots. They knew how to build an elaborate hairstyle from its foundation and hold it in place through a long day of social obligation. Their knowledge was accumulated and practical, and in many cases genuinely impressive. So let us begin here, in the dim hour before full daylight, in a room that smells of oil and something faintly herbal and the warm particular smell of someone who has just woken after sleep. And let us follow what happens, step by careful step, because the details are what make this real. The first thing that happened in the Roman morning beauty routine was washing, not a full bath that came later in the day, usually in the public baths in the afternoon, but a careful morning wash using water that had been brought in a basin, probably cool at this hour, though some households had access to heated water even in the morning through the hypocaust systems that ran beneath wealthier homes. The face was washed first, carefully with soft wool or a fine cloth. Roman women were aware that the skin of the face required gentle handling. There are references in the medical literature of the period to using ass's milk for washing the face, and this was not merely a poetic fancy. Ass's milk was genuinely valued for its composition. It is slightly acidic, it contains lactic acid in small amounts, and those properties would have had a mild exfoliating and softening effect on the skin. Whether or not a particular woman had access to ass's milk, the principle was widely understood. The morning wash was meant to cleanse without stripping, to prepare the skin for what came next. What came next was the application of preparations that we would recognize today as something between skincare and cosmetics, though those two categories blurred considerably in Rome. The Latins did not draw our distinction between treating the skin and adorning it. A substance that improved the skin's appearance was both medicine and beauty aid simultaneously, and the same preparation might appear in a medical text and a cosmetic manual. One of the most commonly discussed preparations was a mixture used as a base for the face, something that evening out the complexion and gave it the smooth, pale quality that Roman beauty standards prized above almost everything else. Roman beauty ideals are worth understanding clearly because they explain so much about what these women were doing and why. Pale skin was beautiful, not because the Romans had any particular logic about race as we might understand it today, but because pale skin was a marker of status. It meant you were not working in the sun. It meant your life was lived indoors, in the shade of a colonnaded garden, in the cool interior of a comfortable house. A woman with tan skin had been exposed to the sun in ways that implied outdoor labor, or at minimum, a life without the leisure to stay sheltered. So the preparation of the face began with evening out the tone and lightening the complexion as much as possible. Cerussa, that cream I mentioned at the very beginning of our evening, was the primary tool for this. Its base ingredient was white lead. It was ground fine, mixed with other substances to create a smooth, spreadable cream, and applied to the face and sometimes the neck and shoulders. It worked. It worked very well, in fact. It created exactly the pallor that was considered beautiful, exactly the smooth, flawless surface that indicated careful self-presentation, and it was poisonous. Roman physicians were aware of this. There are warnings in the texts. Pliny the Elder, whose natural history is one of our richest sources for understanding Roman material life, discussed the toxicity of lead compounds with genuine concern. But beauty standards have a way of outlasting medical advice, and women continued to use cerussa for centuries. The lead absorbed slowly through the skin, accumulating over time, and the long-term effects would have included the neurological and systemic damage that chronic lead exposure causes. This is not something the Romans fully understood, but they understood enough to know the substance was not entirely safe, and they used it anyway because the social consequences of appearing ungroomed, of looking like a woman who did not maintain her appearance, were in their own way just as dangerous. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because there is something deeply human in it. The willingness to accept a certain kind of harm in order to meet the expectations of your social world, the calculation, usually not even fully conscious, that the cost of nonconformity is higher than the cost of compliance. This is not a Roman problem, it is a human problem, and it helps us understand these women not as people doing strange and incomprehensible things, but as people navigating a world with specific demands and making the best choices they could within it. But not every preparation used was harmful. Far from it. Many of the ingredients in the Roman cosmetic tradition were genuinely effective, and some of them appear in modified forms in modern skincare even today. Honey was widely used, applied directly to the skin or mixed into preparations. Its antibacterial properties were not understood in scientific terms, but its effects were observed. Skin treated with honey healed faster, stayed softer, resisted certain kinds of irritation. Rose oil, pressed from petals in a labor-intensive process, was deeply valued both as a perfume and as a skin preparation. Rose contains natural acids and aromatic compounds that have genuine benefits for the skin's surface. It was expensive, which made it prestigious, which made its use in beauty preparations a kind of dual signal. It worked, and it also announced that you could afford something that worked beautifully. There was also a tradition of using substances that we might now categorize as mild exfoliants, ground seeds, fine meal, the gentle abrasives that would remove the dull surface layer of skin and leave something softer and more receptive underneath. This practice was well established in the Roman world and described in enough detail that we can reconstruct the general method. A fine paste made from something like barley flour or ground lentils, mixed with a small amount of oil, rubbed gently into the skin and then washed away. Simple. Effective. The same principle behind expensive exfoliating treatments sold in beauty shops today. The eyes received their own particular attention. Roman women used a dark preparation around the eyes that functioned much like what we would call eyeliner or kohl. The most common ingredient was stibnite, antimony sulfide, a dark mineral that could be ground to a powder and mixed with oil or fat to create a substance that could be applied with a small stick. The resulting line around the eye served multiple purposes in the Roman understanding. It made the eye appear larger, darker, more dramatic. It was considered to protect the eyes from the brightness of the Mediterranean sun, and it was deeply fashionable, a visual marker of a woman who knew how to present herself. There were also preparations used to darken and define the eyebrows, and there is considerable evidence that Roman women gave significant thought to the shape of their brows. The unibrow was, at certain periods, considered attractive, a sign of intellectual depth or sensitivity. At other periods, carefully arched separate brows were preferred. The standards shifted with fashion as they always do, but the attention given to the eyebrows never wavered. They were a feature worth cultivating. All of this was happening in a room lit by oil lamps, by the slowly growing light coming through the window openings in the wall, by the particular quality of attention that only comes in the quiet before the day begins. A woman sat. Her ornatrix moved around her with practiced ease, handing her things, applying preparations with careful fingers, standing back to assess the result. There would have been conversation sometimes. The relationship between a woman and her personal attendant could be genuinely close, the intimacy born of proximity and shared knowledge. There are references in Roman literature to women confiding in their attendants, to the ornatrix knowing things about her mistress that no one else knew. This was the space where the public face was constructed, and constructing it required a witness. But let us move further into the morning. Let us follow the full arc of what happened before a Roman woman was ready to step outside her door. The hair was its own entire undertaking. Roman women's hairstyles varied enormously across the centuries, and following the fashions of different periods gives you an almost exact calendar of Roman history. When the wife or daughter of the emperor changed her hairstyle, it rippled outward through the entire social world. Portraits on coins, sculptures in public spaces, showed the imperial family's appearance, and those images traveled across the empire and influenced what women everywhere thought was appropriate, desirable, correct. There are examples of portrait busts from the 1st and 2nd centuries where the face of the subject is beautifully carved in marble, while the hairstyle is carved separately and was designed to be detachable, swapped out for a more fashionable version as styles changed. This tells you something about how seriously hairstyle was taken. Seriously enough that someone commissioned a portrait with a modular hairdo. The elaborate hairstyles of the early imperial period, the ones you see in busts of Roman women from the time of the Flavian dynasty in the late 1st century, were breathtaking in their complexity. Rows of tight curls arranged in a kind of architectural crest at the front of the head, built up sometimes to remarkable heights, with the rest of the hair arranged in intricate braids and coils pinned with ivory or bone hairpins at the back and sides. To achieve these styles, the ornatrix used heated metal rods, calamastry, to create the curls. These were heated in a small container of hot coals and then wrapped with sections of hair to form the curl. This required skill and care. Too hot and the hair would burn or break. Too cool and the curl would not hold. The ornatrix learnt through practice exactly the right temperature and the right technique for each particular hair type. There is a letter from a Roman woman, or what is described as such in the sources, complaining that her ornatrix had burned her ear with one of these heated implements. Ovid, the poet whose work gives us many of our most direct glimpses into the daily life of Roman women of his era, mentions in passing that a woman in the grip of irritation over a botched hairstyle might lash out at the ornatrix responsible. He actually advises against this, not from sympathy for the ornatrix exactly, but from the practical observation that taking your frustration out on the person styling your hair tends to make the hairstyle worse. For women who did not have naturally thick or long hair, or who wanted to achieve a style that required more volume or length than nature had provided, there were hairpieces. Wigs and hairpieces in Rome were made from real human hair, imported from various parts of the empire. Blonde hair from the Germanic provinces was particularly prized and expensive. Dark hair from other regions served different purposes. The use of supplemental hairpieces was not hidden or shameful in the Roman world the way it might be in some later periods. It was practical and acknowledged, just another tool in the construction of the appropriate appearance. The hair was oiled before it was worked with. Oiling the hair was standard practice, serving the same purpose that hair oil has always served, adding moisture, reducing frizz, creating a surface that takes styling and holds it. The oils used were the same ones used throughout the Roman beauty tradition, olive oil being the most common and accessible, but also imported oils, castor oil, almond oil, preparations made by infusing oils with fragrant botanicals. The hair of a well-maintained Roman woman smelled of something between kitchen and garden, a warm, botanical, slightly sweet smell that was entirely unlike any smell we would associate with hair products today. When the hair was finished, it was secured with an impressive array of hairpins. Hairpins from Roman archaeological sites come in tremendous variety: simple bone pins that were purely functional, elaborate gold and silver pins with decorative heads depicting animals or flowers or miniature faces, ivory pins, glass pins, pins with amber inlay. They were collected, displayed, given as gifts, inherited. A Roman woman's hairpins were a small but meaningful part of her material culture, and finding them in the archaeological record gives us a direct line into those morning routines. Now I want to pause for a moment and ask you to simply picture the scene we have been building. A room in the morning, the particular cool quality of early light in a Mediterranean city. A woman seated, patient, practiced at this patience because she has been doing this since she was old enough to sit still for it. Her attendant working with careful hands, lifting and pinning and assessing. The smell of oil and something faintly floral. The sound of the city beginning outside, at first distant and then gradually closer and louder as the morning advances. This was daily life. This was the texture of an ordinary morning, repeated for a lifetime, the small ritual that prepared a person to enter their world. And that preparation mattered in ways that went beyond personal taste. A Roman woman's appearance was not simply a matter of her own preferences, it was a social document. It communicated her status, her character, her husband's prosperity, her family's standing. It was read by everyone she encountered. Arriving at a social occasion with poorly arranged hair or an inadequate complexion preparation was not simply a personal failure, it reflected on the household. It raised questions about the husband's ability to provide for his wife, about the family's organization and discipline, about the woman's own sense of propriety and care. Marriage was the primary social institution through which Roman women of the citizen class moved in the world, and the maintenance of appearance was explicitly connected to the maintenance of marriage. A wife who let herself go, who stopped attending to her appearance, was understood to be expressing something, either her husband's declining fortunes or her own flagging commitment to the relationship. The poet Propertius is full of anxious attention to his beloved's grooming habits. Ovid's Ars Amatoria, the famous manual on the art of love, devotes considerable space to the question of how women should care for their appearance, and the framing is always practical and slightly urgent. You are maintaining something valuable, Ovid implies. Do not be careless with it. But Ovid also does something interesting that I find worth pausing on. In another work, Medicamina Faciae Feminae, the cosmetics for the female face, he gives actual recipes. He tells you how to make preparations. He includes ingredients and methods, and he does so with a kind of respect for the craft of it that is easy to miss if you are reading quickly. The making of these preparations was knowledge, and knowledge deserved to be transmitted carefully. There are recipes in that text for pastes made from roasted lupine seeds and ground barley and eggs and crushed narcissus bulbs, for preparations using dried rose petals and frankincense and myrrh. Some of these sound like poetry. Some of them, when you look at the actual chemical properties of the ingredients, make a certain practical sense. Let us follow a Roman woman through the rest of her morning and into the wider world of Roman beauty practice, because the private bedroom routine was only one layer of a much more extensive system. The baths, the Roman baths, the thermae and the smaller neighborhood barnier that served more modest populations were extraordinary institutions, not just places to wash, but places to socialize, to exercise, to receive certain kinds of medical treatment, to simply exist in community with other people in a way that was different from any other space in the Roman world. A Roman woman's visit to the baths was part of her daily or near-daily routine, and it was as much a social event as a hygienic one. Most public baths had separate sections for men and women, or designated hours for each. The women's sections contained the same basic sequence of rooms that made Roman bathing its own distinct art. You moved from the apoditerium, the changing room, through the frigidarium, the cold plunge room, through the tepidarium, the warm intermediate room, into the coldarium, the hot steam room, and sometimes back again, in a sequence that was understood to cleanse the body deeply and thoroughly. The heat opened the pores. The scraping that followed removed the loosened dead skin and the oil that had been applied to the skin before entering. The cold plunge afterward tightened everything, shocked the system pleasantly, left the skin smooth and the body feeling genuinely refreshed. The scraping process is worth describing carefully because it is one of those details that immediately shifts how you think about Roman bathing. Before entering the hot rooms, the body was rubbed down with oil, often scented, sometimes mixed with preparations believed to benefit the skin. Then, after time in the steam, a tool called a strigil was used to scrape the skin clean. The strigil was a curved metal blade, usually bronze, shaped somewhat like a slightly flattened crescent. You drew it along the skin and it lifted away everything, the oil, the loosened dead cells, the sweat, all of it collected into a greyish residue that scraped off cleanly. The result, once washed away with water, was skin that felt entirely different from skin simply washed with water alone, genuinely cleaner at a deep level, softer, more receptive to anything applied afterward. Personal strigils were owned items, part of the set of bathing equipment that Romans carried with them to the baths, in a container called a balneum or a scrinium. The equipment set typically included the strigil or strigils, a container for oil, a flask or two for water, and whatever personal preparations the bather was in the habit of using. Wealthier women had these sets made in silver or bronze, with decorated handles. A well-made set of bathing equipment was a gift worth giving and receiving. a practical object made beautiful because Romans understood that objects used daily deserved to be beautiful. At the baths, a woman was not alone. She brought her ornatrix or another personal attendant, possibly a slave specifically employed as a masseur, for massage was part of the bathing routine for those who could afford it. After the scraping and the washing, oil was applied again, worked into the muscles, along with whatever relaxing or strengthening preparations were in current fashion. The body was cared for methodically, from the scalp to the soles of the feet. The feet, actually, received dedicated attention in the Roman beauty tradition. Calluses were removed, nails were trimmed and sometimes stained. The skin of the feet and legs was oiled and softened with the same care given to the skin of the face and hands. This reflects something important about the Roman understanding of beauty. It was not only about the visible surfaces that appeared above a neckline, it was total. A body that was properly cared for was properly cared for everywhere, even in the places that only you and your most intimate attendants would ever see. I want to stay at the baths a little longer because the social dimension of the bathing experience tells us something important about how beauty existed in Roman culture as a collective practice rather than a purely individual one. When Roman women gathered at the baths, they shared information. Recipes moved from woman to woman in the steam of the caldarium. A preparation that one woman had found effective for lightening skin discoloration would be described to a friend, the ingredients named, the method explained, the source of the best quality ingredients identified. Beauty knowledge circulated in this way, through conversation, through demonstration, through the accumulated social knowledge of women in proximity. It is exactly the kind of information sharing that does not leave formal written records, but that we can infer from the pattern of similar recipes appearing in texts from different periods and regions. Someone was spreading this knowledge. It was traveling through social networks, and the baths were one of the primary nodes in that network. There was also a visible quality to the baths as a social stage. A Roman woman at the baths was being seen. Her body, her care of it, the quality of her equipment, the behavior and presentation of her attendants, all of it was visible in a way that everyday life mostly was not. And she was seeing others in turn. The competitive and aspirational dimensions of beauty culture operated fully in this space. A new style of hair depilation, a particularly effective method for removing body hair, would be observed and inquired about. A skin so flawlessly prepared that it caught the attention of the room would prompt questions. The baths were a marketplace of beauty information as much as a place of physical cleansing. Hair removal deserves its own moment of attention because it is one of those areas where Roman beauty practice diverges most sharply from many modern expectations. Roman women removed body hair as a matter of course and considered the failure to do so a mark of poor grooming. The methods available to them were several, and none of them were what we would call comfortable. Depilatory creams existed in the Roman world. They were made from caustic substances, lime-based preparations, or from mixtures that included substances like orpiment, which is arsenic trisulfide, a yellow mineral that could remove hair by chemically breaking down the protein structure at the skin's surface. These preparations were effective and also potentially irritating to the skin. They required careful application, a brief wait, and then thorough removal. This was another area where the ornatrix's knowledge and skill made a significant difference in the outcome. There was also plucking, using metal tweezers that have been found in great numbers in the archaeological record. Roman tweezers appear in bronze and iron, and sometimes in more precious metals, small practical tools designed for the detailed work of hair removal from the face or other sensitive areas. And there was resin or pitch applied warm to the skin and then pulled away when it hardened, the ancient precursor of modern waxing. This too appears in the Roman sources as an established practice, though the descriptions of it are typically brief and matter-of-fact, suggesting it was simply part of the routine, not remarkable enough to require extensive commentary. The preference for hairlessness in Roman beauty culture was not simply about aesthetics in a narrow sense. It connected to broader ideas about the body and civilization. Hairiness was associated with barbarism, with the provinces, with people who lived without refinement. A body carefully maintained, including the removal of unwanted hair, was a civilized body, a Roman body. The beauty practice was simultaneously a cultural statement, and this is something I want to sit with for a moment, because it is something that runs through the entire Roman beauty tradition and connects it to the world of social meaning rather than purely personal vanity. Almost nothing that Roman women did to their appearance was purely for themselves. Everything operated within a system of meaning, of social reading, of expectations and judgments that were collective rather than individual. The choice of how to present your face, your hair, your body, your clothing was never made in isolation. It was always made in relation to what was expected, what was admired, what was censured, what was read as appropriate or inappropriate for your station, your age, your marital status. A married woman was expected to look like a married woman. The stola, the long garment specific to married citizen women, was not just a piece of clothing, it was a signal. A woman wearing it announced her status publicly and took on the public obligation of maintaining that status through her behavior and appearance. Widows had their own codes. Young unmarried women had theirs. The social life of Roman women was organized partly through the visible language of appearance, and the morning routine was the process of composing that language carefully before stepping into the world to be read. Let us go back to that morning room, to the lamplight and the oil smell and the careful hands working at a woman's hair, and let us think about what was actually being created there. A statement, a daily crafted statement that said, "I am who you think I am. I have maintained what I was expected to maintain. I have attended to the obligations of my position. You can trust what you see." The perfumes. Let us talk about perfumes, because in the Roman world, the use of scent was as elaborate and considered as any other aspect of beauty preparation, and it encompassed dimensions of meaning that go well beyond simply smelling pleasant. Rome imported perfume ingredients from across its vast trading network. From Egypt came kifi, a complex compound preparation that had been used in Egyptian religious ritual for millennia and that the Romans adopted and adapted. From Arabia came frankincense and myrrh, familiar from religious contexts but also used in personal perfumes and cosmetic preparations. From India came nard, spikenard, a heavily scented root that produced a deep, earthy fragrance particularly prized in ancient perfumery. Cinnamon, cassia, costus, calamus. The spice routes that connected Rome to the east were partly perfume routes, and the trade was enormous. Pliny the Elder complained about the amount of gold Rome was spending on eastern luxuries, and specifically named perfumes and unguents among the goods for which the balance of trade was unsatisfyingly in Rome's disfavor. The preparation of perfumes was itself a specialized craft, and there were professional perfumers in Rome, the unguentarii, who prepared and sold both the ingredients and finished preparations from their shops, the tabernae unguentariae, which clustered in certain areas of the city. Visiting the perfumer was part of the process of acquiring what you needed for your beauty routine. It was also, like the baths, a social act. The perfumer's shop was a place to learn what was new, what was fashionable, what had arrived recently on the ships from Alexandria or Petra. The method of Roman perfume making relied primarily on infusing the fragrant substances into oil rather than the distillation process that characterizes modern perfumery. Oil, usually high-quality olive oil or almond oil or another carrier, was heated gently with the fragrant materials and allowed to absorb their essence over time. The resulting scented oil was then strained and sometimes further processed. More concentrated preparations, the unguents, had a thicker consistency and could be stored in small containers and applied directly to the skin, the hair, the clothing. The diluted versions were applied more generously, perhaps poured into a warm bath or rubbed into the skin after the bath. The scenting of the body was systematic rather than casual. Different preparations might be used on different parts of the body. There is a reference in Pliny to a Roman general or aristocrat who used one scent on his forearms, another on his chest, another in his hair, a kind of layered perfume wardrobe applied deliberately to create a particular overall impression. Women engaged in similar complexity. The hair might be scented with one preparation, the skin of the neck with another, the clothing with yet another. The overall effect was intended to be rich and layered, rather than a single strong note. Certain scents had particular associations in the Roman world. Rose was connected to pleasure and to the goddess Venus, and using rose-scented preparations was a choice with connotations that Romans would have recognized immediately. Frankincense was religious, associated with temple ritual and the divine. which gave it a certain gravitas when it appeared in personal use. Nard was both luxurious and slightly exotic, its Indian origin making it a signal of access to the global trade that connected Rome to distant places. The economics of perfume use created their own social distinctions. The most expensive ingredients were genuinely very expensive, and using them liberally was a display of wealth as surely as wearing gold jewelry. Cheaper preparations existed, of course, and were used by women throughout the social spectrum. The smell of a woman walking through the streets of Rome might immediately communicate something about her position, a point that Roman writers make from time to time, with varying degrees of subtlety, and scent was understood to have effects that went beyond simple pleasantness. The medical literature of the period discusses various fragrant preparations in terms of their benefits for health, their ability to strengthen the spirits, improve the mood, aid certain conditions. This aligns with a broader Roman understanding of beauty preparations as existing on a continuum with medicine and the perfumer's craft as related to the physician's. The boundaries between these categories were porous in ways that would surprise us today when we draw sharp lines between the cosmetic and the medical. Now I want to take us somewhere slightly different within the same world, because the Roman beauty tradition was not confined to the private home and the public baths. It extended into the market, into the shop, into the relationships between women and the people who supplied what they needed. The cosmetic shops of Rome were significant commercial establishments. We know their locations in certain cities because of graffiti and signs, because of the amphorae and small pots that still survive in the archaeological record, because of the concentration of relevant finds in particular neighborhoods. These shops sold the raw ingredients for preparations that women made at home, or they sold prepared cosmetics ready to use, and the range of what was available was extensive. The ingredients sold at a Roman cosmetic shop would have included mineral pigments for complexion preparations, ground chalk and white lead for lightening effects, red ochre and other mineral reds for adding color to the cheeks and lips, carbon-based substances for darkening around the eyes, imported plant materials, dried flowers and barks and resins, animal products including fat and honey, and various substances derived from animal tissues, plant oils, and the tools needed to work with all of these materials, small spatulas, fine brushes made from soft animal hair, grinding stones, mixing vessels in pottery and stone. The women who ran or worked in these shops were often themselves specialists in the preparation and application of cosmetics. The cosmeta, the women who specifically applied cosmetics to other women's faces in professional contexts, were another category of specialist in the Roman personal care economy. Some women of the wealthy classes employed cosmeti who did nothing but this work, bringing to it the same level of skill and practice that we have seen in the ornatrix who handled hair. The application of cosmetics was considered a craft, something that required training, a good eye, and steady hands. Let me tell you about the specific cosmetic sequence that a Roman woman of middling to good means might have used each morning, because the practicality of the details is grounding in a way I find genuinely satisfying. After the morning wash, after the skin had been dried carefully with soft cloth, the first preparation applied was typically something to even the complexion and provide a smooth base, the cerussa we discussed earlier, or, for women who preferred something less heavy or who were more cautious about its composition, alternatives existed. White lead was sometimes replaced with white substances derived from plant sources or mixed with other ingredients to dilute its concentration. The texture of the preparation was worked to be smooth enough to apply evenly without obvious streaks. Over this base, color might be added. The cheeks might receive a touch of fucus, which was the general term for reddish preparations applied to the face. The sources for red pigment were varied: red ochre, a natural iron oxide, the dried bodies of certain insects, an ancient precursor to modern cochineal, crushed red berries. The specific preparation varied by what was available and affordable. The application was done with the fingers or with a fine implement, and the intention was to add a quality of life and color to a complexion that had been deliberately whitened almost to the point of pallor. The interplay between the white base and the added color created the particular Roman beauty aesthetic. Very white skin with deliberately placed points of warm color at the cheeks and sometimes the lips. The lips might receive their own preparation, a darker red than the cheeks, applied carefully. The sources mention wine lees, the sediment left after wine was pressed, used as a lip coloring, crushed rose petals mixed with a little fat, various berry preparations. The exact formulations varied, but the practice of coloring the lips was established and widespread enough that references to it appear across Roman literature in ways that suggest every reader knew exactly what was being described. The overall effect of a fully made-up Roman face was quite different from what we typically associate with natural-looking makeup in modern contexts. It was explicitly constructed. The whitened face, the added color, the darkened eyes, these were visible as deliberate choices, not attempts to create the illusion of bare skin. This was ornamentation acknowledged as ornamentation. The beauty standard was not invisibility of effort, but rather the evident fact of effort, the visible care taken with the presentation of oneself. There is a passage in Ovid, from the same cosmetic text I mentioned earlier, where he describes his experience of entering a woman's dressing room and seeing all the tools and preparations laid out, and finding the sight somewhat alarming. He makes a joke of it, but underneath the joke there is a real observation. The materials of female beauty preparation were hidden from casual view deliberately. You were meant to see the result, not the process. The dressing room, the private morning routine, the ornatrix and her implements, all of this was kept out of sight so that the finished face could appear in public as though it had simply always been that way. The constructed nature of beauty was both widely understood and politely not acknowledged. Ovid himself understood this with considerable sophistication. He advises women to complete their beauty preparations before allowing their husbands to see them, and the reasoning he gives is interesting. Not that the preparations are shameful, but that the sight of the process undercuts the magic of the result. The man should see you put together. He should not watch you become put together. The backstage should remain backstage. This tension between the visible result and the hidden process is something that runs through the entire Roman beauty tradition, and it connects to a broader truth about how beauty functions socially. Beauty as a social performance requires a kind of collective agreement to treat the result as natural, to see the finished face as simply the face, not as the product of an hour's skilled labor. The ornatrix who constructed the hairstyle was not acknowledged. The preparations in their clay pots were kept out of sight. The morning routine happened behind closed doors, and when the woman emerged into the atrium to receive her morning visitors or stepped out into the street to make her round of calls, she appeared as though she had simply woken up this way. Let us think for a moment about the ornatrix herself, because she is easy to overlook in a narrative that focuses primarily on the women being attended to, and she deserves her own moment of attention. The ornatrix in a Roman household was typically an enslaved woman. This is the central and uncomfortable fact of the Roman beauty economy. The skilled labor that made these elaborate routines possible was extracted from people who had no choice about providing it. An ornatrix who was skilled could be a valuable household asset, her expertise something the household literally invested in. She might be trained from a relatively young age. She might be given access to good materials precisely because her work reflected on the household that employed her. A badly trained or inattentive ornatrix produced bad results that were visible on her mistress's face in public, and this reflected poorly on everyone. The relationship between a Roman woman and her ornatrix was thus a relationship between a person with power and a person without it, which is the basic structure of all enslaved free relationships in the Roman world. But within that fundamental inequality, there were enormous variations. Some ornatrices were treated with genuine consideration. They were valued for their skill and their intimate knowledge. They were trusted with information and proximity that servants of lower status in the household could not access. Their work required a kind of attention and care that its practitioners presumably brought some degree of personal commitment to, even within constraint. There are references in the sources to ornatrices who had long relationships with their mistresses, who accompanied them across life's changes, who were eventually freed, and there are also references to the other side of the relationship, the frustration that sometimes expressed itself in cruelty, the ornatrix whose work did not meet expectations and who suffered for it, the small violence that could erupt in that intensely private space. Roman satire and comedy are full of such moments, usually played for a kind of dark humor that the Romans apparently found amusing, though it tells us something about the power dynamic that is considerably less amusing when considered soberly. What the ornatrix knew, All that specific knowledge about preparations and techniques and individual preferences was a form of power within her powerlessness. She knew things, she had expertise. She was, within the narrow confines of her role and her situation, genuinely skilled and knowledgeable in ways that had value, and in some cases, this expertise gave her a small but real degree of protection. A skilled ornatrix was too valuable to mistreat carelessly. Let us move out from the private room and into the wider world of Roman beauty culture, because the beauty practices of Roman women were embedded in a larger social and commercial ecosystem that encompassed everything from agricultural production to long-distance trade. The raw materials for Roman beauty preparations came from everywhere. Olive oil, the base of so many preparations, came from across the Mediterranean basin, from the groves of Spain and North Africa, and Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean, pressed in stone mills that have survived in the archaeological record and sent in amphorae stamped with their origin and quality. The specific quality of olive oil mattered. The best, most delicate oil pressed from young olives early in the season was for eating and for certain delicate cosmetic preparations. Older or coarser oil for cooking and more robust preparations. The Romans understood olive oil with a sophistication that reflected its absolute centrality to their material culture. Beeswax, used in preparations that required a solid or semi-solid consistency, came from apiaries throughout the empire. Honey, similarly. The beekeeping shun in the ancient world was sophisticated and widespread. The medical and cosmetic uses of honey were understood well enough that high-quality honey was a commodity worth trading across considerable distances. Animal fats, rendered from various animals depending on what was available in the region, formed the base for preparations that required something solid at room temperature, something that would melt against the warmth of the skin. Bear fat appears in Roman cosmetic texts as a preparation used to encourage hair growth, and it was apparently understood that the source of the fat might matter to its effectiveness, which probably tells you more about Roman theories of sympathetic magic than about the actual biochemistry. But the use of animal fat in cosmetic preparations was practical and widespread and not in any way considered unusual. The trade in pigments and mineral ingredients for cosmetics connected Rome to its furthest trading partners. Lead obviously came from mining regions in Spain and Britain and elsewhere. Coal ingredients traveled from Egypt and the Near East. Certain prized coloring agents came specifically from distant places, their rarity adding to their value as beauty materials. The cosmetic supply chain of ancient Rome was genuinely global in scope, knitting together agricultural producers, miners, traders, shippers, shopkeepers, and ultimately the household ornatrix working with a small spatula in a lamplight room. I find something genuinely moving in this, that a woman doing her makeup in a Roman bedroom was the end point of a supply chain that stretched across the known world, that the oil on her face had been pressed in a grove in Spain and shipped in a clay jar across the Mediterranean, that the dark pigment around her eyes had been ground from mineral deposits in Egypt and carried along trade routes that had existed for centuries before Rome dominated them. The private, intimate moment of the morning routine was connected to the entire material world of the empire, and this connection was not unconscious. Romans were aware of the geographic origins of their luxury goods in a way that made using them a kind of statement about the world they lived in. Using nard from India or frankincense from Arabia was a reminder, deliberately invoked, that Rome stood at the center of a vast network of exchange, that being Roman meant having access to the best things from everywhere. The beauty ritual was also, in this sense, an expression of imperial self-understanding. But let us come back to the women themselves. Let us think about what this daily practice actually felt like from the inside, as much as we can reconstruct that across 2,000 years. The Roman sources are not rich in detailed first-person accounts of what morning beauty routines felt like subjectively, which is not surprising. Private experience rarely makes it into historical records even under the best circumstances, and the inner lives of Roman women are particularly underrepresented in a literary tradition produced overwhelmingly by men. But there are enough traces, enough sideways glimpses to sketch something. There is the physical experience itself. Sitting still while someone works on your hair requires a particular kind of patient attention, a learned stillness, a trust in the person behind you. For women who did this every morning of their adult lives, it would have become as natural as breathing, a meditative state almost. the mind free to think about other things, while the hands of another person created order on your head. There is something genuinely pleasant about having someone else tend to your appearance, something that addresses a basic human need for care and physical attention, and this would not have been less true in Rome than it is anywhere else. There is also the smell, which I keep coming back to because I think smell is one of the most direct routes into a past moment that otherwise resists our grasp. The warm smell of oil, the botanical complexity of a perfumed preparation, the slight sharpness of certain mineral ingredients, the clean smell of freshly washed skin. These are the sensory contents of the morning routine, and they would have been deeply familiar, deeply associated with the transition into readiness, into the state of being prepared for the day. The mirror, the speculum, was another daily companion. Roman mirrors were polished metal rather than glass, usually bronze or silver, and they reflected light in a way that was somewhat less clear and more warm-toned than modern glass mirrors. A woman assessing her face in a Roman mirror was seeing something slightly different from what we see in our reflections, a warmer, slightly softer image, less clinical, more forgiving perhaps. The assessments made in front of that mirror, the small adjustments, the final checks, the moment of looking at the completed version of yourself and deciding it was ready, this was also part of the routine. Mirrors appeared in Roman material culture in an enormous variety. Small hand mirrors, often with decorative backs featuring mythological scenes or geometric patterns. Larger mirrors mounted in frames. Mirrors kept on dressing tables alongside the other implements of the beauty routine. A woman's mirror was a personal object, intimate in a specific way that connected to all the private moments it had witnessed. Let us think now about the differences in this routine across the social spectrum, because the Roman world was not uniform in its experience of beauty practice, and those differences are important. At the very top, the women of the imperial family and the senatorial aristocracy, the beauty routine could reach extraordinary elaboration. We have accounts, some of them probably exaggerated, of the resources deployed in the service of certain famous women's beauty practices. Poppaea Sabina, the wife of Nero, is described in sources from the period as traveling with 500 asses so that she could bathe in their milk every day. This is almost certainly an exaggeration, or at minimum a significant rounding up of a real practice. But it reflects the understanding that women of extreme wealth and high visibility had access to beauty preparations that were genuinely extraordinary, and that they deployed that access as part of the theatre of power. At the other end of the spectrum, enslaved women within the household had no access to quality preparations. Their grooming was minimal and practical rather than elaborate. A slave woman's hair was typically kept short or simply arranged, not for her own aesthetic pleasure, but for the convenience of the household. The elaborate, time-consuming beauty routines required time that was not available to women whose every hour was owned. Between these extremes, the range is vast. Women of modest means in the citizen class, craftswomen, merchants' wives, the wives of soldiers, had their own versions of the beauty routine. Simpler preparations, fewer steps, less expensive ingredients, no ornatrix but perhaps a neighbor's help or the assistance of a daughter. The principles of the routine were the same. The investment of time and the specific materials varied enormously by what was available and affordable. There is something worth noticing about this variation, which is that the expectation of beauty maintenance did not scale down proportionally with wealth. The expectation that a woman would present herself as groomed and maintained was broadly shared across social classes. The cost and elaboration of what maintained that appearance varied, but the standard itself was not understood as a purely upper-class concern. The woman whose morning routine consisted of washing her face carefully and doing her hair as neatly as she could and putting on clean, well-mended clothing was engaging in the same social performance as the woman who spent an hour with her ornatrix and then visited the best baths in the city. Both were fulfilling the expectation. Both were participating in the same social language, just with different vocabularies, and both felt the same underlying pressure, which was the pressure of judgment, of living in a world where your appearance was a public document that other people read and assessed and commented on. Roman literature is full of comments on women's appearance, some admiring, many critical. The culture of appraisal was intense and largely normalized. Women knew they were being looked at and assessed, and they prepared accordingly, with the combination of genuine care for their own appearance and awareness of the social stakes that this entailed. The aging body deserved particular attention in the Roman beauty tradition because the pressure to maintain a youthful appearance was explicit and considerable. Beauty in Roman culture was closely associated with youth, and the markers of aging, grey hair, wrinkles, looser skin, were not typically celebrated. The cosmetic tradition had responses to all of these. Hair dye was widely used. The Roman pharmacological texts contain numerous recipes for preparations intended to cover or eliminate grey hair, ranging from a paste made from walnuts, which actually do contain compounds that stain hair dark, to preparations involving various plant extracts, to some involving substances that were probably less effective and possibly harmful. The principle was consistent. Grey hair was acceptable to hide. For the skin, the preparations intended to address the appearance of wrinkles were particularly elaborate. Pliny and others describe various treatments, poultices of grain and egg, applications of plant-based preparations intended to tighten and smooth, specific ingredients believed to restore the skin's youthful quality. Some of these were almost certainly ineffective except in the most temporary sense. Others may have had genuine mild benefits. The important thing is that the effort was made, the attention was devoted. The Roman beauty tradition took seriously the idea that the visible signs of aging could and should be addressed. This connects to a larger Roman anxiety about time, and specifically about the relationship between beauty and time. The poets return to this theme constantly, sometimes with explicit melancholy, and sometimes with something more philosophical, but always with the acknowledgement that beauty as defined by youth is temporary, and that this temporariness gives it both its value and its poignancy. The morning beauty routine, from this angle, was partly a daily act of resistance against time, a reaffirmation that you had not yet given up the effort. Let me take a different angle now and talk about what beauty meant specifically in the context of marriage, because this is where the stakes of the beauty routine become most clearly connected to the larger social structure of Roman women's lives. Roman law, social expectation, and philosophical tradition all oriented women primarily toward the household, and specifically toward the household organized around marriage. Marriage was the central social institution for women of the citizen class in Rome. It was the primary means of economic security, of social position, of legitimate participation in the civic world. Divorce existed and was relatively accessible in Rome, particularly in the later Republic and the imperial period, but it came with social costs, especially for women. A woman who had been divorced was in a more precarious position than a woman currently married. However, unhappily, within this framework, a wife's appearance was connected to the stability and success of her marriage in ways that were not merely aesthetic. A wife who looked well-maintained communicated to the social world around her that her household was functioning, that her husband was providing adequately, that the domestic arrangements were in order. A wife whose appearance suggested neglect or indifference raised uncomfortable questions. Was her husband not providing what she needed? Had she stopped caring about the relationship? Was something wrong? The social readings of a woman's appearance within marriage were detailed and consequential. There is a particular passage in Ovid that I find both fascinating and somewhat disturbing in its directness. He addresses women who have committed to a relationship, essentially telling them that the work of maintaining their beauty is work that must continue indefinitely within the relationship, not something to be relaxed once the goal of securing a partner has been achieved. The man who chooses you based on your appearance has in some sense been promised that appearance, the reasoning goes, and you owe him its maintenance. This is stated frankly and without irony, and while Ovid's tone throughout his work is playful, the underlying social norm he is describing is real and significant. Women internalized this norm. They understood that their daily beauty routine was not simply a personal practice, it was a form of social contract fulfillment. And this understanding shaped not just the morning routine, but the entire relationship between Roman women and their own appearances across their lifetimes. Let us go deeper into the specific ingredients and preparations, because I think the details are where the real texture of this world lives, and because the science of Roman cosmetics is genuinely interesting on its own terms, separate from any larger social analysis. Chalk was widely used as a whitening agent. Ground very fine, mixed with water or oil or fat, it created a smooth white paste that could be spread across the face. It was more accessible than white lead and less toxic, though the Romans did not frame the comparison in these terms. The chalk-based preparations were somewhat less durable than the lead-based ones, requiring reapplication more frequently, but for everyday use they were an adequate and more abundant resource. Orris root, the root of certain iris species, was used as a perfume base and also as a dry powder applied to the skin. The smell of orris root is difficult to describe. It is faintly floral, slightly sweet, with a violet-adjacent quality that is attractive without being strong. Ground to a fine powder, it was used in preparations for the hair and also applied directly to the skin. Modern perfumers still use orris root as a base note, a fixative, a substance that holds and extends other fragrances. The Romans understood its value empirically, even without the chemistry to explain why. Lentils, ground and used as an exfoliant, have a gentle abrasive quality and also contain starch, which can leave a slight softening film on the skin when used in a paste. The Romans prepared them in specific ways for cosmetic use, roasting them first and then grinding them to different degrees of fineness depending on the intended application. The same ingredient prepared differently served different purposes. This kind of nuanced practical knowledge was part of what the ornatrix brought to her work. The use of animal substances in cosmetics extended well beyond simple fat. There are references to the use of various animal-derived materials whose specific benefits were believed to be connected to properties of the animal itself. The fat of a specific animal might be believed to convey some quality of that animal's strength or beauty. The bile of certain animals was considered valuable in specific preparations. Some of these beliefs had no empirical basis and would have produced no actual effect. Others may have hit upon real chemical properties by accident. The history of cosmetics is full of this kind of accidental efficacy, sitting alongside complete ineffectuality, and the Roman tradition is no exception. What is striking about the range of ingredients in Roman cosmetics is how much of it was ultimately agricultural. The core of the tradition was plant-based and oil-based, and deeply connected to the agricultural life of the Mediterranean world. The fig, the olive, the rose, the grape, the various herbs that grew in the Mediterranean climate, all of these fed into the cosmetic tradition as surely as they fed into the culinary and medical traditions. Beauty practice was part of the same material culture as food production and medicine, sharing ingredients and knowledge, and sometimes personnel. The physician who treated disease and the woman who managed household beauty preparations were drawing from overlapping pools of knowledge, and the line between them was not as sharp as we might expect. Some Roman women had quite sophisticated practical chemistry knowledge, not in the abstract scientific sense but in the practical sense of knowing which substances mixed well together, what reactions to expect, what proportions of ingredients produced the desired result. This was household knowledge, the kind passed down through practical experience and observation rather than written documentation, and it was genuinely valuable. Let me now take you into a specific type of mourning that is slightly different from the one we have been inhabiting. Let us think about the morning before a significant social occasion, a dinner party, a religious ceremony, a visit to the theatre, a formal call on an important acquaintance, because these mornings had their own heightened quality within the routine. On a morning before a special occasion, the beauty routine began earlier and proceeded more deliberately. There was more time allocated. The expectations were higher. The ornatrix would have been informed the previous evening and would have come to the dressing room with the specific preparations appropriate to the occasion already in mind. The hairstyle would be more elaborate than the everyday version, requiring more time and more pins and possibly more supplemental hairpieces. The cosmetic preparations would be applied with greater care and perhaps in additional layers. The selection of jewelry was part of the process on such mornings. Roman women's jewelry was both beautiful and communicative in the same way that their clothing and grooming were. Gold jewelry indicated wealth. Specific pieces communicated specific things. Earrings of particular types were fashionable at particular periods. The weight of gold at a woman's throat and wrists told observers something about the household she represented. The selection of appropriate jewelry for an occasion required its own knowledge and judgment, and the trusted ornatrix often participated in or advised on this process. The clothing itself received attention on such mornings. The stola of a married citizen woman and the palla worn over it came in materials and colors that communicated different things. White was appropriate for religious occasions, more elaborate colored garments for social ones. Purple, genuine Tyrian purple dyed with the mucus of the murex shellfish was outrageously expensive and thus restricted in its use to those who could afford it and wished to display that they could. The selection and arrangement of clothing was as much a part of the morning preparation as the application of cosmetics, and the whole process worked together to create the complete presentation. The final moment of the morning routine, the last check in the mirror before stepping through the door, had a particular quality on these heightened occasions. Everything that could be done had been done. The face was as prepared as it could be, the hair was as perfect as skill could make it, the clothing was as correct as circumstance allowed, and what came next was the performance itself, the navigation of the social world for which all of this preparation had been the backstage work. I want to hold on to that image for a moment, the threshold, the moment between the private room and the public world, because it is a moment that recurs in the lives of people across all times and places, this particular movement from the prepared private self into the evaluated public world. And in the Roman context, that threshold was charged with the full weight of social expectation, of the knowledge that appearance would be read and assessed and responded to, of the understanding that the work of the morning was about to be tested. Roman women crossed that threshold every day. They had been prepared for it from girlhood, trained in the practices and the expectations, taught by their mothers and the women of their households what was required and how to achieve it. The morning routine was not something that sprang up fully formed in adult life. It was learned, and the process of learning it was itself part of the transmission of Roman feminine culture from one generation to the next. Let us think about that transmission, because it is one of the most interesting dimensions of the Roman beauty tradition. A Roman girl growing up in a household of reasonable means would have watched the morning routine happening around her from her earliest years. She would have seen her mother or the older women of the household going through the steps. She would have seen the ornatrix at work. She would have absorbed, simply by proximity, the knowledge of what the routine consisted of, what was expected, what was valued. This informal transmission of knowledge was supplemented in some cases by explicit teaching. A girl approaching marriageable age, which in Rome could be as young as the early teenage years for the formal ceremony, though many girls did not actually begin cohabiting with husbands until somewhat older, would have been specifically instructed in the care of her appearance as part of her preparation for adult life. The same knowledge also traveled sideways between women of similar age and status, at the baths, in the social calls that structured the Roman afternoon. Through the networks of female friendship and acquaintance, information about beauty preparations moved. A new ingredient that was particularly effective, a technique that had been observed in someone else's household, a preparation recommended by a physician, all of these traveled through the social networks of Roman women and enriched the collective knowledge that any individual woman could draw upon. There is something quite beautiful about this network of knowledge, about the idea of women sharing practical expertise across centuries, about the way that information about caring for the body traveled through the same social channels as gossip and news and personal affection, the knowledge that certain plant extracts affected the skin in particular ways, the knowledge of which oils were best for which purposes, the understanding of how to mix and apply the preparations. All of this was part of what women knew and shared with each other, and it represents a genuine intellectual tradition even if it was not recognized as such by the predominantly male world of formal Roman learning. Now let us talk about the things that could go wrong, because the Roman beauty tradition, like any beauty tradition, had its failures and its dangers and its cautionary tales, and these tell us something important about the real conditions under which these practices operated. We have already discussed the white lid, the cerussa, and its toxicity. This is the most serious of the dangers embedded in the Roman beauty tradition, but it is not the only one. The depilatory preparations using orpiment, that arsenic-based yellow mineral, were genuinely hazardous. Arsenic is absorbed through the skin, and chronic exposure to arsenic sulfide would have had effects that accumulated over time. The Romans understood that these preparations could irritate the skin badly if left on too long or used too frequently. They understood that they required careful handling, but the long-term systemic effects of chronic arsenic exposure were not something they had the framework to understand. The heated implements used for hair curling could and did burn skin and hair. The cosmetic texts and the satirical literature both reference burns from calamistry as a recognized occupational hazard of the ornatrix's work and an occasional source of grievance in the household. Some preparations for the eyes were irritating. The antimony compounds in eye preparations, if applied too close to the actual eye surface, could cause inflammation. The chronic use of lead-based preparations around the eyes was another route for lead absorption. The eye was a delicate organ, and the Roman practice of elaborate eye makeup carried genuine risks, and there was always the risk of adulteration in the commercial preparation of cosmetics. The cosmetic trade was unregulated in any systematic way, and the opportunity for unscrupulous sellers to substitute cheaper or more harmful ingredients for the ones they claimed to be selling was real. The texts that warn against purchasing certain preparations from untrustworthy sources reflect a real awareness that quality varied enormously and that the source of what you were putting on your face mattered. Despite all these dangers, the practice continued and expanded. The beauty tradition of Rome grew more elaborate across the centuries of the Republic and the Empire, not simpler. More ingredients became available through trade, more techniques were developed and refined. The commercial infrastructure of cosmetic shops and professional cosmeta grew. The social expectations became, if anything, more specific and more demanding over time, rather than less. This tells you something about the relative weight of the social pressure versus the health risks. The social consequences of failing to maintain appearance were, in the lived experience of Roman women, more immediately present and more consistently threatening than the health consequences of the preparations used to maintain it. The lead absorbed slowly, and its effects might not be obvious for years. The social judgment for appearing unprepared happened today, in the moment, in front of the people whose opinion of you shaped the conditions of your daily life. The calculus, if it was made consciously at all, consistently resolved in favor of the appearance over the health risk. Let us now spend some time on the hair specifically, because Roman attitudes toward hair were nuanced and deeply connected to ideas of identity, status, and virtue that went well beyond simple aesthetics. The hair of Roman citizen women was, outside of certain ritual contexts, kept long and arranged. Long hair on women was considered appropriate and beautiful. The elaborate arrangements that we associate with high Roman fashion were built on this foundation of naturally long hair, supplemented where necessary with artificial additions. The act of letting the hair down, of wearing it loose and unbound, was significant in Roman culture, but was largely restricted to specific ritual contexts and private moments. In public, a respectable woman's hair was always arranged, always controlled, always signaling through its management that she was a person under appropriate social and domestic governance. Hair cutting was associated in Roman culture with mourning and with certain ritual states. Cutting the hair as an expression of grief was recognized and expected. A woman in mourning might also leave off her usual cosmetics and wear plain clothing, her whole appearance a demonstration of her state. The removal of the normal beauty routine in this context was itself a kind of communication, the deliberate undoing of the usual presentation to signal that the usual social world had been disrupted. The color of hair carried its own associations. Roman women were predominantly dark-haired, and dark hair was the Roman norm, but blonde and red hair, particularly associated with Germanic and Gaulish peoples respectively, were admired as exotic and used the visual idiom of otherness. The blonde wigs made from hair imported from the northern provinces were simultaneously a luxury good and a kind of aesthetic statement, a way of wearing a color that nature had not provided while everyone understood that nature had not provided it. The wig was an acknowledged performance rather than an attempted deception. Grey hair was another matter. As I mentioned earlier, grey hair was the visible sign of age, and age in Roman beauty culture was something to be managed rather than displayed. The preparations intended to darken grey hair were numerous and varied in their chemistry. Some were essentially dyes that deposited color on the hair shaft. Others claimed to restore the natural color through some more mysterious process. The walnut preparations that appear in several texts were probably at least partially effective, as walnut husks contain juglone, a dark organic compound that does genuinely stain the hair. Other preparations were likely less successful. The management of grey hair connects to a broader Roman conversation about the relationship between appearance, age, and social role. a conversation that was not entirely unlike what we see in our own contemporary culture. The expectation that women would maintain youthful appearance into middle age was partly about the genuine association of beauty with youth in the Roman aesthetic framework, but it was also about the social roles that Roman women occupied and the expectation that they would continue to occupy them effectively. A woman who looked old was implicitly announcing that she was finished with certain aspects of social life, and many women were not ready to make that announcement regardless of what their hair was doing. Let us step back now and look at the full arc of what we have been exploring, because I think it is worth taking a moment to hold the whole picture before we go any further. We have been inside the private rooms of Roman women, inside the processes by which they prepared themselves each morning for the world that waited outside their doors. We have followed the specific ingredients and techniques of an elaborate beauty tradition. We have thought about the social meanings embedded in these practices, the connections to marriage and status and power, and the transmission of knowledge between women. We have sat with the complications, the health risks, the labor of enslaved attendants, the pressure of a culture that evaluated women continuously through the lens of their appearance. And what I hope has emerged from all of this is a picture of Roman women's beauty practice that is neither simply admirable nor simply appalling, but human, deeply, recognizably human. These were women navigating a social world with the tools available to them, making choices within a framework of constraints they mostly did not choose and could not simply walk away from, finding meaning and perhaps even pleasure in some aspects of their daily routines while bearing real costs in others. The morning beauty ritual of a Roman woman was many things simultaneously. It was work, skilled and time-consuming. It was communication, a daily statement composed in the language of appearance. It was connection to the ornatrix whose hands shaped the hairstyle, to the other women whose preparations and recipes and tips had contributed to the knowledge base being drawn upon. It was risk, physical in the form of the ingredients used, and social in the form of the consequences of getting it wrong, and it was, in some fundamental sense, an act of participation in the world, a way of saying, I am here, I am present, I have met the requirements of my time and place. I am ready. 2,000 years separate us from the women who sat in those lamplight rooms waiting for their ornatrices to finish with their hair. The specific preparations they used, most of them we would recognize as dangerous or as simply not what is used today. The social framework that made those preparations feel necessary was profoundly different from anything we inhabit. The world they lived in was a world organized around slavery and around the legal subordination of women in ways that are both historically specific and genuinely troubling, and yet, there is something that reaches across those 2,000 years with surprising directness, the weight of getting ready, the strange mixture of care and ritual and performance and habit that constitutes the daily act of preparing a face to meet the world, the social knowledge embedded in knowing how to look appropriate, the labor that goes into what appears effortless, the knowledge passed from woman to woman, generation to generation, about how to inhabit a body in a social world. These are human things, not merely Roman things, and recognizing them in the Roman context does not diminish their seriousness in our own. Let us go back into the warm room, into the smell of oil and morning, and follow the last moments of the routine as the city outside comes fully awake. The hair is done. The face is prepared, the selection of jewelry has been made, the stola has been arranged and the palla draped with the particular care that communicates social confidence without appearing vain, the final check in the polished bronze mirror, the turn of the head to see the arrangement from another angle, the small satisfied assessment that yes, this is sufficient, this is ready. The ornatrix steps back. Perhaps she offers a small comment of professional approval, or perhaps she says nothing, the silence itself a form of confirmation. She begins to put away the implements, the pins and spatulas and small pots, returning them to their places in the containers where they live between uses, and the woman crosses the threshold, moves out of the private room into the more public spaces of her own house first, the atrium where morning callers might already be waiting, the tablinum where her husband conducts his business, the household that her management and her appearance both support and represent, and from there, eventually, into the city itself. Rome outside is loud and bright and full of bodies in motion. The smell of it is complex and sometimes overwhelming. The street vendors are at their stations. The public fountains are crowded. The porticos of the larger public buildings provide shade for the conversations and transactions that constitute so much of Roman social life, and among the people moving through all of this, women of various stations, various purposes, various levels of morning preparation, each one a small performance in progress, each one the culmination of a morning routine that may have taken 10 minutes or 2 hours or anything in between. A woman of means moves through this space with a particular quality of attention to her own visibility. She knows that she is being seen. She knows the language in which she is being read. She has prepared for this every morning for as long as she has been in public life. The preparation has become so habitual that it barely requires conscious thought. It is simply what mornings are, simply the process by which she becomes herself, the self that moves in the world rather than the self that exists in the private hours. And yet, beneath the habitual ease of it, the same underlying awareness persists, the awareness of being evaluated, the awareness that the evaluation is continuous and that the preparation must be also, that there is no morning off from the requirements of being a Roman woman in public. The routine must continue because the expectations do not pause. Let us now move into a different kind of private space, away from the morning bedroom and into the afternoon hours, because the Roman beauty routine did not end with the morning preparation. It was in a sense ongoing throughout the day. The midday hours in Rome during the hot months were hours of rest, a retreat from the heat of the streets into the cooler interiors of houses, a period of stillness before the afternoon's social round. These hours were also for women of leisure, a time when certain aspects of maintenance could continue quietly, a refresh of preparations that had worn through the morning's activities, a moment of attention to the hands or the feet that had been postponed from the morning. The nap that Romans generally took in the afternoon, the siesta that the Mediterranean climate and the Roman social schedule made both possible and sensible, was a period during which the demands of appearance were briefly suspended. Waking from the afternoon rest, there was sometimes another small version of the morning routine. The face might be refreshed, the hair checked and repinned where pins had loosened, the clothing smoothed, the perfume, which might have faded through the morning and the midday heat, reapplied. Because the afternoon was when the baths were visited, when social calls were made, when the late afternoon into early evening social round that was such an important part of Roman upper-class life began, and that period required its own readiness. The visit to the baths in the afternoon was itself a continuation of the beauty routine by other means, the cleansing, the striduling, the oiling, the possible massage, the conversation with other women in the tepid, warm social space of the tepidarium. The baths were where the morning's preparation met the social world of the afternoon and either held up under scrutiny or required adjustment. A Roman woman who had spent the morning constructing her presentation would have known whether the afternoon baths were an opportunity to refresh and renew, or whether something had gone wrong earlier that needed correction. After the baths, emerging clean and oiled into the late afternoon light was another application of preparations. The freshly cleaned skin received its cosmetics again, the freshly washed and dried hair was rearranged. If a dinner party was the evening's destination, the preparations became more elaborate again at this point. If the evening was to be domestic, the refreshed but simpler version sufficed. The dinner party, the convivium, was an important social institution in Rome, and appearance at a dinner party was evaluated carefully by everyone present. The guests at a Roman dinner reclined, the Roman fashion for eating in formal contexts, on couches arranged around the tables. This meant that bodies were displayed at length, that clothing fell in specific ways, that the whole visual presentation of a person was laid out for appraisal over the course of an evening. Hair that was still well arranged by the end of a long evening demonstrated the quality of the ornatrix's work. A complexion that held up through the warmth of the dining room and the heat of wine demonstrated the quality of the preparations used. These were tacit tests that every dinner party imposed. Roman dinner parties were also spaces for performance in a broader sense, conversation, music, the recitation of poetry, the general social display of wit and culture, but the visual performance was continuous and fundamental to all of it. The way a woman looked while she reclined at a dinner party, the quality of her appearance over the course of an evening, was itself a form of social capital, something that her presence either contributed to or detracted from the evening's overall quality. And yet within the formality of all of this, there were moments of genuine pleasure, the pleasure of a well-made thing, a preparation that worked, a hairstyle that held perfectly, a perfume that earned comment, the pleasure of a body well cared for, the The small satisfaction that attends on any kind of craft when it goes right, the pleasure of being among others, of the conversation and the food and the music, within which the beauty preparation was the enabling condition rather than the point in itself. I think it is important not to reduce the Roman beauty tradition entirely to its social function, to its role as social currency and performance and communication. There is genuine sensory pleasure in many of the practices we have been discussing, the warmth of the oil as it is worked into the skin, the particular feel of clean skin after the strigil and the water, the smell of a well-composed perfume, the small ritual satisfaction of the morning sequence, familiar and reliable as any well-practiced daily activity. These pleasures are real and human, and they do not disappear just because the same practices also served social functions. The women who performed these routines were not simply executing a social requirement, they were also, within and alongside that execution, experiencing something. The care taken with the body, the attention given to its preparation and presentation, the knowledge and skill brought to bear on it, these all have a quality of respect for the self that is not entirely about the external social gaze. The preparation of the body was, among its other functions, also an act of self-regard, of taking seriously the material and sensory reality of existing in a body in the world. Let us now think about the specific Roman understanding of the relationship between inner character and outer appearance, because this understanding shaped the whole framework within which the beauty routine operated. Roman moral philosophy, in various of its schools, had things to say about the appropriate relationship between outward appearance and inner character. The Stoic tradition, which was enormously influential in the educated Roman world, tended toward a certain suspicion of excessive attention to appearance. The Stoic ideal was the philosopher or statesman whose inner virtue expressed itself without need for external ornament. An excessive attention to outward presentation suggested that the inner was insufficient and needed propping up by the outer. This argument appears in various Roman texts as a kind of moral critique of elaborate beauty preparation. But this critique was largely applied to women from the outside and by men who were themselves subject to quite different social expectations regarding appearance. For Roman women, the expectation of maintaining their appearance was itself part of the social moral framework. A woman who neglected her appearance was not being admirably philosophical, she was being negligent of her duties. The apparent contradiction between Stoic critique of vanity and the practical social expectation of maintained appearance was resolved by understanding them as applying to different degrees. Some attention to appearance was appropriate and required, excessive attention was vain and reproachable. The line between the two was, as usual, drawn somewhere in the middle by social consensus rather than logical precision. There was also a Roman concept of beauty that understood it as a kind of natural gift, something that certain women simply had in abundance and others had less of. This gift, like other gifts, could be cultivated and developed through care and preparation, or it could be squandered through neglect. The daily beauty routine was, from this angle, the proper cultivation of a natural endowment, not a false creation but a careful development of what was already there. This framing made the routine not merely permissible but actually a kind of moral obligation. You had been given something. You were responsible for its maintenance. This philosophical framing worked to embed the beauty routine even more firmly in the web of Roman women's moral obligations, rather than allowing it to be understood as a purely optional personal practice. A woman who maintained her appearance was fulfilling a responsibility. A woman who did not was in some sense failing at something she owed to her household, her husband, her social position, and ultimately to herself. I want to now take a longer view and think about how the Roman beauty tradition changed and evolved across the centuries we are considering, because it was not static. The early Republican period in Rome, the centuries before the great expansion of Roman power and wealth into the Eastern Mediterranean, was characterized by a more austere aesthetic in general. The material culture of early Rome was simpler, the imports fewer, the commercial infrastructure less developed. Beauty practices certainly existed, but the elaboration that we associate with imperial-era Roman cosmetics was not yet present. The traditional Roman virtue of gravitas, the quality of seriousness and dignity, was emphasized in a way that pushed against excessive ornamentation. The Roman matron of the early Republic was idealized as someone whose beauty was natural and whose presentation was dignified rather than elaborately cosmetic. As Rome's military and commercial expansion brought it into sustained contact with the Hellenistic world, with Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean cultures that had long traditions of elaborate cosmetic practice, everything changed. The goods and the knowledge that came back with Roman expansion included the entire cosmetic tradition of the Hellenistic world, its ingredients, its preparations, its understanding of what beauty required and how it should be achieved. The shops of Alexandria and Antioch had long sold the kinds of preparations that only began to appear in Rome in quantity after the Middle Republic. This influx of new beauty culture was met with predictable ambivalence by Roman commentators. On one hand, the new preparations and techniques were clearly desirable, clearly effective, clearly connected to the cosmopolitan sophistication that expansion had brought access to. On the other hand, they were foreign, associated with the soft luxury of the East, the kind of thing that traditional Roman values were supposed to resist. The complaints about Roman women adopting Greek or Egyptian beauty practices appear in texts from the Middle and Late Republic, and they tell us, precisely because they are complaints, that the adoption was happening on a large scale. By the imperial period, the Hellenistic cosmetic tradition had been thoroughly absorbed into Roman practice, and the Roman version had developed its own elaborations and innovations on top of it. The full, elaborate morning routine we have been describing, with its multiple preparations and specialized implements and skilled attendants, was the product of this synthesis. It was neither purely Roman in origin nor purely Greek or Egyptian. It was the accumulated tradition of the Mediterranean world as it had consolidated under Roman governance, and as the empire expanded further, more ingredients and ideas continued to flow in from beyond its original borders. The Indian and Arabian trade that brought nard and frankincense and cinnamon added new dimensions to the perfume tradition. Silk from further east, Chinese silk, was used in the clothing that provided the backdrop to all the cosmetic preparation. The Roman beauty tradition at its peak was a genuinely global phenomenon, drawing on the products and knowledge of an enormous geographic range. Now let us think about what happened to all of this as evening came. The evening's conclusion of the day brought the reverse process of the morning. The prepared public face was returned to its private state, the pins came out of the hair, the cosmetic preparations were removed, the body was washed again, more simply this time than in the morning, a quick cleanse rather than an elaborate preparation. And there was a period, the private evening hours before sleep, when the Roman woman existed simply as herself, without the constructed public presentation, in the quiet of the household's interior. These hours had their own small routines. The preparation of the hair for sleep, which involved removing all the pins and ornaments, combing and sometimes oiling the hair, and arranging it loosely for the night. The application of preparations intended to work overnight, to soften the skin while sleeping, to address specific concerns while the body rested. This was the time for the preparations that worked slowly, the masks and the intensive treatments that Roman women applied to the face before sleep and washed off in the morning. Pliny and other writers mention preparations intended to be applied at night, a preparation made from barley and egg white and ground narcissus bulb that was spread over the face in the evening and left to do its work while sleeping. These overnight preparations reflect a sophisticated understanding of the skin as something that could be actively worked on even during rest, that the night hours were not wasted but could be deployed in service of the morning's presentation. The night creams of ancient Rome, in their clay containers on the dressing table, waiting to be applied in the lamplight of the evening, connect directly to the products in their glass and plastic containers on modern bathroom shelves. The specific chemistry is entirely different. The understanding of why they work is entirely different, but the practice, the idea that you can prepare the skin overnight for better results in the morning, that the evening is a useful time to invest in what the following day will present, this is the same across the 2,000 years. Let me take you now to a very specific and somewhat quieter kind of Roman woman, one we have not spent much time with yet, and let us think about how the beauty tradition looked from her position, not the wealthy woman with her ornatrix and her baths and her elaborate morning routine, but a woman of modest means in a Roman city, a woman whose husband was a craftsman or a small shopkeeper, who lived perhaps in a rented apartment in one of the densely inhabited insulae that made up the bulk of Roman urban housing. Her morning routine existed within a very different set of constraints. The apartment she woke in was smaller, with less privacy, less access to hot water, no attendants whose sole purpose was her personal preparation. She had perhaps one or two preparatory items on a small shelf. Her hair arrangements were simpler, though not unattended. She understood the social language of appearance as well as the wealthy woman understood it, because living in the same city, encountering the same social expectations, reading the same visual codes in the people around her, she had absorbed the same knowledge, but the means available to her for meeting those expectations were far more limited. She would have washed her face with whatever water was available, probably cold water from a clay jug. She might have had a small pot of some preparation for the skin, something she had made herself from accessible ingredients or purchased cheaply from a neighborhood shop. She might have used a simple red ochre to add some color to her cheeks, something widely available and affordable. Her hair she would have arranged herself, having learnt the techniques from watching and practicing since girlhood, without the assistance of a skilled ornatrix but with the same general goals of neatness and appropriateness. The stola she wore was simpler in its fabric and its making than the stola of a wealthy woman, but it served the same function. The jewelry she wore, if she wore any, was less valuable, but the social meaning of wearing it was the same. She was demonstrating, through all of these choices and practices, that she was a woman who knew what was required and could meet the requirements even within constraints. The performance was the same, the budget for producing it was vastly different, and this creates a kind of social pressure that operated specifically on women of middling means, a pressure that we might recognize, the expectation of meeting standards that were defined by the upper end of the social spectrum, using resources that fell well below that standard. The gap between what was expected and what was available had to be bridged by ingenuity, by the substitution of time and knowledge for money, by prioritizing the most visible aspects of presentation and simplifying what was less visible. There is a line in one of Ovid's texts that I have been thinking about throughout this evening, something along the lines of the sentiment that a poor woman who does not dress well has no excuse because art is available to everyone, even when wealth is not. He is talking specifically about the craft of making the most of what you have, the substitution of skill and attention for expensive materials, and this is genuinely the reality of the Roman beauty tradition at the modest end of the spectrum. The same underlying knowledge about what worked, the same general goals of what was to be achieved, but accomplished through whatever means were at hand. This democratization of beauty knowledge, the fact that the same general practices and goals applied across the social spectrum, even when the resources for achieving them varied enormously, is part of what makes the Roman beauty tradition so coherent as a cultural phenomenon. It was not simply a luxury practice for the wealthy. It was a social expectation that applied broadly, that was communicated broadly through the visual culture of Roman cities, and that women throughout the social hierarchy attempted to meet according to their means. The cosmetic shops we talked about earlier served this broad market. There were preparations at many price points. There were raw ingredients that could be purchased in small quantities for individual preparations at home. There were ready-made items that cost more but saved time. The commercial infrastructure of Roman cosmetics was responsive to the full range of what women needed and could afford, which is another way of saying that the demand for beauty products in Rome was genuinely widespread, crossing the obvious class boundaries. Let us think now about the sounds of this world. We have spent a lot of time with the smells and the textures and the visual details of the Roman beauty routine, but sound also matters, and attending to it can deepen the picture. The sound of a city waking in the early morning is one of the most characteristic sounds of any settled human community, and Rome's version would have had its own particular quality. The rumble of carts on the stone streets, permitted only at night and in the early morning, was something Romans complained about constantly, a source of lost sleep and general irritation. By the time most households were deeply into their morning routines, this rumbling would have been fading as the day advanced and the cart traffic ended. What replaced it was the sound of commercial activity beginning, the sounds of the street vendors calling their goods, the noise of the various workshops, smiths and potters and weavers, and all the other crafts that were carried out in the ground floor spaces of Rome's insulae, opening for the day and beginning to produce their particular sounds. The street was never quiet during daylight, but the quality of the noise shifted over the course of the morning, becoming fuller and more complex as the city came fully awake. Inside the private room where the morning routine was underway, the sounds were more intimate, the small sounds of implements being moved, of a cosmetic pot being unstoppered, of pins being placed in a container, the sound of a comb moving through hair, the occasional softly spoken consultation between the woman being attended and the ornatrix doing the attending. Perhaps, from elsewhere in the house, the sounds of the household coming to life, other family members beginning their mornings, the preparation of the morning meal in the kalina and outside, penetrating through the narrow window openings but not overwhelming the private space, the city, always the city. Rome was never truly quiet even for a moment, and the women performing their morning routines were never fully separate from that noise, even in their most private preparations. The city was the context, the audience, the world for which the preparation was being made. There is something about the simultaneity of all of this that strikes me as deeply human. While one woman in one room was having her hair pinned, thousands of other women across the city were doing the same thing, or some version of it, each in their own room with their own means and their own level of elaboration, all of them making the same essential transition from private to public self, all of them participating in the same daily ritual of preparation for the world. The city moved on its rhythms, the sun climbed higher, the shops filled with customers, the forum filled with petitioners and merchants and advocates. The baths began to warm for the afternoon visit, and through all of this, the accumulated work of thousands of morning routines was present in the streets, in the social calls, in the dinner parties, in the simple act of encountering another person in the public space of the city and reading them through the visual language they had composed with such care. Let me now think about the beauty tradition in its connection to Roman religion, because the two are not as separate as we might assume. The goddess Venus was the most directly relevant divine figure to the Roman beauty tradition, and the connections between beauty practice and veneration of Venus were explicit and acknowledged. Rose, sacred to Venus, appeared in beauty preparations in part because of that sacred connection. Certain preparations, certain rituals of grooming were understood to honor the goddess by honoring the gift of beauty she was understood to confer. The daily beauty routine was not worship in any formal liturgical sense, but it carried overtones of sacred attention to a divinely given quality. Beyond Venus, the Roman religious world intersected with the beauty tradition in the realm of protective magic and the warding off of the evil eye. The belief in the evil eye, the harmful gaze of envy or malice that could injure a person who was conspicuously beautiful or fortunate, was widespread in the ancient Mediterranean world and deeply embedded in Roman popular religion. Amulets and preparations and specific behaviors were used to deflect or neutralize the evil eye. The fact that beauty specifically attracted attention and therefore potential harmful gazes meant that beauty preparations and the protective practices around them were connected. A woman who went out beautifully dressed and groomed might wear certain amulets, specifically because that beauty made her vulnerable. The preparation of the face and the protection of the face were understood as related concerns. Certain beauty preparations were also understood to have protective or magical dimensions beyond their obvious cosmetic effects. A preparation that contained ingredients with symbolic associations might be understood as providing not just a physical benefit, but a kind of magical protection or enhancement. This is the same logic that appears in the use of substances with particular symbolic resonances in magical practices throughout the ancient world, and it is not surprising that it appears in the cosmetic tradition as well. The ornatrix herself might know something of these protective practices and incorporate them quietly into her work. A specific herb whose smoke was directed toward the finished hairstyle, a brief invocation while applying a preparation, small ritual elements woven into the practical sequence of the morning routine without necessarily being distinguished from the practical elements. Magic and practical action were not cleanly separated in the Roman worldview, and the morning beauty routine could contain both without contradiction. Let us slow down a little now. Let us breathe with the weight of all of this history, all of this detail, all of these small specific human lives arranged in their specific small specific daily rituals. The oil on the skin, the pin in the hair, the polish on the metal mirror, the city waking outside. 2,000 years ago, and the women in these rooms as fully present as any of us have ever been. There is a kind of vertigo in history if you let yourself really feel the depth of it. All those mornings, all those lamps lit before dawn, all those hands working at hair with practiced care, all those small clay pots of preparation opened and used and closed again, and then the women who used them moving out into the world, conducting their lives, managing their households, having their conversations, attending the baths, visiting the temples, doing all the specific daily things of their specific daily lives, and then coming home again in the evening and beginning the reverse process, the undoing of the morning's work, in preparation for the night, and then morning again, the lamp again, the oil again, the hands at the hair again, for a lifetime, day after day, season after season, year after year. The routine so deeply habitual that it barely required thought, just the body's memory moving through the familiar sequence, the mind free to be elsewhere while the hands went through the motions it had performed 10,000 times. This is the rhythm underneath all of the historical specificity, the daily repetition, the ritual that structures time and creates continuity across the discontinuous moments of a life, the morning routine as an anchor, a returning, a small daily renewal of the commitment to participate in the world. Now let us think about what was not in the morning routine, what was absent, what was left behind in the private room, what the constructed presentation was carefully designed to conceal, the tired eyes after a poor night's sleep, managed with the carefully applied preparations that reduced their visible evidence, the worry about a husband's mood or a household financial concern, concealed behind the composed face that was the morning's product, the physical discomfort, a headache, a menstrual cramp, the simple ache of a body that had been worked hard, all of it disciplined behind the smooth constructed surface of public presentation, the grief that might be private, the anxiety that could not be shown, the real emotional contents of a life that did not map onto the serene and capable public face being assembled in the morning room. These hours had their own small routines, the preparation of the hair for sleep, which involved removing all the pins and ornaments, combing and sometimes oiling the hair, and arranging it loosely for the night, the application of preparations intended to work overnight, to soften the skin while sleeping, to address specific concerns while the body rested. This was the time for the preparations that worked slowly, the masks and the intensive treatments that Roman women applied to the face before sleep and washed off in the morning. Pliny and other writers mention preparations intended to be applied at night, a preparation made from barley and egg white and ground narcissus bulb that was spread over the face in the evening and left to do its work while sleeping. These overnight preparations reflect a sophisticated understanding of the skin as something that could be actively worked on even during rest, that the night hours were not wasted but could be deployed in service of the morning's presentation. The night creams of ancient Rome, in their clay containers on the dressing table, waiting to be applied in the lamplight of the evening, connect directly to the products in their glass and plastic containers on modern bathroom shelves. The specific chemistry is entirely different. The understanding of why they work is entirely different. But the practice, the idea that you can prepare the skin overnight for better results in the morning, that the evening is a useful time to invest in what the following day will present, this is the same across the 2,000 years. Let me take you now to a very specific and somewhat quieter kind of Roman woman, one we have not spent much time with yet, and let us think about how the beauty tradition looked from her position, not the wealthy woman with her ornatrix and her baths and her elaborate morning routine, but a woman of modest means in a Roman city, a woman whose husband was a craftsman or a small shopkeeper, who lived perhaps in a rented apartment in one of the densely inhabited insulae that made up the bulk of Roman urban housing. Her morning routine existed within a very different set of constraints. The apartment she woke in was smaller, with less privacy, less access to hot water, no attendants whose sole purpose was her personal preparation. She had perhaps 1 or 2 preparatory items on a small shelf. Her hair arrangements were simpler, though not unattended. She understood the social language of appearance as well as the wealthy woman understood it, because living in the same city, encountering the same social expectations, reading the same visual codes in the people around her, she had absorbed the same knowledge. But the means available to her for meeting those expectations were far more limited. She would have washed her face with whatever water was available, probably cold water from a clay jug. She might have had a small pot of some preparation for the skin, something she had made herself from accessible ingredients or purchased cheaply from a neighborhood shop. She might have used a simple red ochre to add some color to her cheeks, something widely available and affordable. Her hair she would have arranged herself, having learnt the techniques from watching and practicing since girlhood, without the assistance of a skilled ornatrix, but with the same general goals of neatness and appropriateness. The stola she wore was simpler in its fabric and its making than the stola of a wealthy woman, but it served the same function. The jewelry she wore, if she wore any, was less valuable, but the social meaning of wearing it was the same. She was demonstrating through all of these choices and practices that she was a woman who knew what was required and could meet the requirements even within constraints. The performance was the same. The budget for producing it was vastly different, and this creates a kind of social pressure that operated specifically on women of middling means, a pressure that we might recognize, the expectation of meeting standards that were defined by the upper end of the social spectrum, using resources that fell well below that standard. The gap between what was expected and what was available had to be bridged by ingenuity, by the substitution of time and knowledge for money, by prioritizing the most visible aspects of presentation and simplifying what was less visible. There is a line in one of Ovid's texts that I've been thinking about throughout this evening, something along the lines of the sentiment that a poor woman who does not dress well has no excuse, because art is available to everyone, even when wealth is not. He is talking specifically about the craft of making the most of what you have, the substitution of skill and attention for expensive materials. And this is genuinely the reality of the Roman beauty tradition at the modest end of the spectrum. The same underlying knowledge about what worked, the same general goals of what was to be achieved, but accomplished through whatever means were at hand. This democratization of beauty knowledge, the fact that the same general practices and goals applied across the social spectrum, even when the resources for achieving them varied enormously, is part of what makes the Roman beauty tradition so coherent as a cultural phenomenon. It was not simply a luxury practice for the wealthy. It was a social expectation that applied broadly, that was communicated broadly through the visual culture of Roman cities, and that women throughout the social hierarchy attempted to meet according to their means. The cosmetic shops we talked about earlier served this broad market. There were preparations at many price points. There were raw ingredients that could be purchased in small quantities for individual preparations at home. There were ready-made items that cost more but saved time. The commercial infrastructure of Roman cosmetics was responsive to the full range of what women needed and could afford, which is another way of saying that the demand for beauty products in Rome was genuinely widespread, crossing the obvious class boundaries. Let us think now about the sounds of this world. We have spent a lot of time with the smells and the textures and the visual details of the Roman beauty routine, but sound also matters, and attending to it can deepen the picture. The sound of a city waking in the early morning is one of the most characteristic sounds of any settled human community, and Rome's version would have had its own particular quality. The rumble of carts on the stone streets, permitted only at night and in the early morning, was something Romans complained about constantly, a source of lost sleep and general irritation. By the time most households were deeply into their morning routines, this rumbling would have been fading as the day advanced and the cart traffic ended. What replaced it was the sound of commercial activity beginning, the sounds of the street vendors calling their goods, the noise of the various workshops, smiths and potters and weavers and all the other crafts that were carried out in the ground floor spaces of Rome's insulae, opening for the day and beginning to produce their particular sounds. The street was never quiet during daylight, but the quality of the noise shifted over the course of the morning, becoming fuller and more complex as the city came fully awake. Inside the private room where the morning routine was underway, the sounds were more intimate, the small sounds of implements being moved, of a cosmetic pot being unstoppered, of pins being placed in a container, the sound of a comb moving through hair, the occasional softly spoken consultation between the woman being attended and the ornatrix doing the attending. Perhaps from elsewhere in the house, the sounds of the household coming to life, other family members beginning their mornings, the preparation of the morning meal in the cucina, and outside, penetrating through the narrow window openings but not overwhelming the private space. The city, always the city. Rome was never truly quiet even for a moment, and the women performing their morning routines were never fully separate from that noise, even in their most private preparations. The city was the context, the audience, the world for which the preparation was being made. There is something about the simultaneity of all of this that strikes me as deeply human. While one woman in one room was having her hair pinned, thousands of other women across the city were doing the same thing, or some version of it, each in their own room, with their own means and their own level of elaboration, all of them making the same essential transition from private to public self, all of them participating in the same daily ritual of preparation for the world. The city moved on its rhythms, the sun climbed higher, the shops filled with customers, the forum filled with petitioners and merchants and advocates. The baths began to warm for the afternoon visit, and through all of this, the accumulated work of thousands of morning routines was present in the streets, in the social calls, in the dinner parties, in the simple act of encountering another person in the public space of the city and reading them through the visual language they had composed with such care. Let me now think about the beauty tradition and its connection to Roman religion, because the two were not as separate as we might assume. The goddess Venus was the most directly relevant divine figure to the Roman beauty tradition, and the connections between beauty practice and veneration of Venus were explicit and acknowledged. Rose, sacred to Venus, appeared in beauty preparations in part because of that sacred connection. Certain preparations, certain rituals of grooming, were understood to honor the goddess by honoring the gift of beauty she was understood to confer. The daily beauty routine was not worship in any formal liturgical sense, but it carried overtones of sacred attention to a divinely given quality. Beyond Venus, the Roman religious world intersected with the beauty tradition in the realm of protective magic and the warding off of the evil eye. The belief in the evil eye, the harmful gaze of envy or malice that could injure a person who was conspicuously beautiful or fortunate, was widespread in the ancient Mediterranean world and deeply embedded in Roman popular religion. Amulets and preparations and specific behaviors were used to deflect or neutralize the evil eye. The fact that beauty specifically attracted attention and therefore potential harmful gazes meant that beauty preparations and the protective practices around them were connected. A woman who went out beautifully dressed and groomed might wear certain amulets specifically because that beauty made her vulnerable. The preparation of the face and the protection of the face were understood as related concerns. Certain beauty preparations were also understood to have protective or magical dimensions beyond their obvious cosmetic effects. A preparation that contained ingredients with symbolic associations might be understood as providing not just a physical benefit, but a kind of magical protection or enhancement. This is the same logic that appears in the use of substances with particular symbolic resonances in magical practices throughout the ancient world, and it is not surprising that it appears in the cosmetic tradition as well. The ornatrix herself might know something of these protective practices and incorporate them quietly into her work. A specific herb whose smoke was directed toward the finished hairstyle, a brief invocation while applying a preparation, small ritual elements woven into the practical sequence of the morning routine without necessarily being distinguished from the practical elements. Magic and practical action were not cleanly separated in the Roman worldview, and the morning beauty routine could contain both without contradiction. Let us slow down a little now. Let us breathe with the weight of all of this history, all of this detail, all of these small specific human lives arranged in their specific small specific daily rituals. The oil on the skin, the pin in the hair, the polish on the metal mirror, the city waking outside. 2,000 years ago, and the women in these rooms as fully present as any of us have ever been. There is a kind of vertigo in history if you let yourself really feel the depth of it. All those mornings, all those lamps lit before dawn, all those hands working at hair with practiced care, all those small clay pots of preparation opened and used and closed again, and then the women who used them moving out into the world, conducting their lives, managing their households, having their conversations, attending the baths, visiting the temples, doing all the specific daily things of their specific daily lives, and then coming home again in the evening and beginning the reverse process, the undoing of the morning's work in preparation for the night, and then morning again, the lamp again, the oil again, the hands at the hair again, for a lifetime. Day after day, season after season, year after year, the routine so deeply habitual that it barely required thought, just the body's memory moving through the familiar sequence, the mind free to be elsewhere while the hands went through the motions it had performed 10,000 times. This is the rhythm underneath all of the historical specificity, the daily repetition, the ritual that structures time and creates continuity across the discontinuous moments of a life. The morning routine as an anchor, a returning, a small daily renewal of the commitment to participate in the world. Now let us think about what was not in the morning routine, what was absent, what was left behind in the private room, what the constructed presentation was carefully designed to conceal. The tired eyes after a poor night's sleep, managed with the carefully applied preparations that reduced their visible evidence, the worry about a husband's mood or a household financial concern, concealed behind the composed face that was the morning's product, the physical discomfort, a headache, a menstrual cramp, the simple ache of a body that had been worked hard, all of it disciplined behind the smooth constructed surface of public presentation. The grief that might be private, the anxiety that could not be shown, the real emotional contents of a life that did not map onto the serene and capable public face being assembled in the morning room. Let us close this evening's journey gently. We have been a long time in Rome. We have been in the lamplight rooms of the morning, in the warm, humid air of the baths, in the small cosmetic shops of the city's commercial districts, in the kitchens and the gardens where preparations were made from available ingredients. We have followed the hands of the ornatrix through the sequence of a morning routine that might have lasted an hour or 2 hours, producing something that would carry a woman through the social demands of her day. We have thought about the social meaning embedded in all of this, the weight of expectation, the connection to marriage and status, and the complex social economy of Roman women's lives. We have sat with the less comfortable aspects, the use of genuinely toxic ingredients, the labor of enslaved attendants, the unrelenting pressure of a culture that evaluated women continuously through the lens of their appearance. And we have found in all of this something human, something that reaches across the centuries with surprising directness, not because the specifics are familiar, but because the underlying human experiences are. The desire to present yourself well, the knowledge that this presentation is learned, transmitted, shared, the small daily ritual that creates continuity in a life, the quiet space of the private room where the public self is assembled. These are things we know. We know them in different specific forms, with different specific pressures and expectations and tools. But the knowing is genuine. The women of ancient Rome who began their mornings in lamplight with oil and pin and careful hands were not so different from us in their fundamental human situation. They were embodied, social, embedded in webs of expectation and relationship and meaning. They cared for themselves and were cared for. They learnt from the women before them and passed what they knew to the women who came after. They performed the daily ritual of becoming presentable with a mixture of habit and attention and genuine skill, and then they stepped out into their world and lived their lives as fully and complexly as any of us do in our own. The lamps they lit before dawn have been out for 2,000 years. The preparations in their clay pots dissolved into the soil long ago. The hair they so carefully arranged has returned to dust. But the practices themselves, the knowledge, the routines, the human impulse toward care and presentation and daily renewal, these have not disappeared. They have simply continued, in their always changing and always recognizable forms, into the morning routines of every subsequent generation, including ours. Let Rome fall quiet around you now. Let the streets go still. Let the city's constant breath ease for once into silence. Let the lamplight in the morning room settle into a warm, steady glow. The ornatrix's hands are still. The mirror is set aside. The small pots of preparation are closed and waiting for tomorrow. The day's work is done. The evening has come, warm and slow, and the city is moving into its night, its kitchens and its dinners and its conversations and its quiet domestic hours. And somewhere in the residential neighborhoods, behind the closed doors of households of various sizes and means, women are undoing the morning's work, taking out the pins, washing the preparations from their faces, letting the hair fall loose, returning to the private self that the morning routine constructs and the evening deconstructs each day. And then the morning will come again, the lamp before dawn, the oil, the hands in the hair, the mirror, the threshold. Day after day, season after season, year after year, a lifetime of mornings, each one a small renewal, a daily recommitment, a ritual so deeply practiced it has become the shape of time itself. Close your eyes. Let the weight of all those mornings settle gently around you, the accumulated weight of all those lives, all that daily care, all that quiet, skilled knowledge passing from hand to hand across centuries. Let it rest as history rests, warm and specific and full of the texture of real human days. Let it be quiet now. The preparations are made. The day is done. The evening is soft and the city is breathing slowly in the way that cities breathe when the urgency of daylight has finally eased. Let yourself rest within it. You have been in Rome tonight. You have been in the lamplight and the oil smell and the careful practiced hands of women who knew exactly what they were doing, who met their days with skill and with the quiet dignity of routine, who prepared themselves each morning for the world and found the world each morning waiting. It is enough. It has always been enough. Let the room grow quiet. Let the lamp settle lower. Let Rome, with all its morning light and its daily ritual and its 2,000 years of accumulated human mornings, drift gently into the place where history rests, warm, present, real, and sleep.